So I think I figured out, maybe Milana may be the only person who knows this, but I think it was only last year that I formally, officially moved my membership to First Christian Church, because before that, I'd always listened to Edenside, because that was my home congregation, and they'd been really important to me. They raised me, and they ordained me, and I had really strong ties there. But even though I only shifted it formally here, you already know you've been my church home for much, much longer than that. You have claimed me in my saddest and my most joyous times, and you have both let me and even asked me to be present for so many of yours. So even though my home church closed last year, I've never been without a church home. And I know what a privilege that is, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. Sadly, this was not always true for the Hebrews in Egypt. In fact, it wasn't until the God of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, heard their cry and transformed them from no people into this people. It was by God's power alone that this happens. And in our book that we've been working through, Sabbath as Resistance, which we still have a couple copies if you would like your own, Walter Brueggemann says that before God came along, the Hebrews had been considered marginal, objectionable. The Egyptians didn't even really want to eat with them. And when they were in Egypt, they were slaves. And I don't use that word lightly as a white American whose familiarity with slavery is not from ancient, far-off times, but from a much too recent past. And so then it is only through God's power that the Hebrews are freed from this slavery. They are rescued from the literal shackles of the Egyptians and Pharaoh's screwed up, anxious, making, consumerist way of being, and instead brought into a new land full of milk and honey for a whole new God-shaped way of life. And not only had they been freed, but they had been claimed and named. They had become members of a community that must be cared for and treasured. And because being a member of that community was so valuable, they decided they needed to establish boundaries for membership. And I thought, man, as humans, we love rules. We're on it like that, unless it's the rule that God tells us to rest one day every week, and then we're not really good at it at all. But from the Israelites' point of view, they were trying to protect their community and this precious title of being chosen by God. So they made food rules and clothing requirements and ways to plow their fields and ways to treat the widow and the orphan and the alien among them. They believed that these things would help them maintain their purity, to be pure, and more importantly, to protect the larger community. But sometimes it also meant, or they believed, it also meant listing those who simply couldn't be members. And they did this as a reminder of how serious membership was and how urgent it was to eliminate anyone or anything that was a risk to the community. They weren't the first and they weren't the last to try this method. Last weekend, due to the flip of schedules, I got to go see Footloose, which was really fun. And in the midst of the awesome 80s music, there was also this much darker theme about a pastor and a town trying to protect themselves and their children from harm by banning anything they thought that would put them in danger. And all of this happened because of their own pain and fear and grief after losing 4 teenagers in a car accident that had involved alcohol and drugs. And so instead of addressing kind of the core real issues at the bottom of that, they just pointed outward at dancing and rock music and curfews in order to protect their community, or so they believed. In order to protect their community, the Israelites did that on a much bigger, scale with much harsher consequences. They would purge whole groups of people from the community. And they had lists of them in Scripture. They would purge false prophets and murderers, those who defy the priest, rebellious children, prostitutes, eunuchs, adulterers, kidnappers, and certain foreigners, though oddly, not all foreigners, only the ones that seem to have recently offended them. And some of those make sense, murderers, kidnappers, but I got to rebellious children, and I thought, who gets to make that call? And wouldn't that be everybody at some point in the community? And they believed that seemed to work okay, seemed to keep them safe or in community and pure, according to them, until the Babylonians showed up. And then a huge part of the population got overtaken, and somebody else decided who got purged and who got to stay. And so the Israelites ran into this problem where they had to reconsider what it meant to be a member when so many people had become foreigners and been taken to a foreign land. There had been those who had been deported and those who hadn't. There had been those who had cooperated with the authorities and those who hadn't. So who is still in and who isn't was a major concern. And after this exile, you see this shift happen, that in the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's a lot of focus on exclusion. And then later, in the writings of Isaiah, this shift happens towards inclusion. And that's where we read from today. And I said we're reading from the Message, so it will not sound like your Pew Bible, but I think I liked this version of it. So, make sure no outsider who now follows God ever has occasion to say, God put me in second class, I don't really belong. And make sure no physically mutilated person is ever made to think I am damaged goods, I don't really belong. For God says, to the mutilated who keep my Sabbaths and choose what delights me and keeps a firm grip on my covenant, I'll provide them an honored place in my family and within my city, even more honored than of my sons and daughters. I'll confer permanent honors on them that will never be revoked. And as for the outsiders who now follow me, working for me, loving my name, and wanting to be my servants, all who keep Sabbath and don't defile it, holding fast to my covenant, I'll bring them to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. They'll be welcome to worship the same as the insiders, to bring burnt offerings and sacrifices to my altar. Oh, yes, my house of worship will be known as a house of prayer for all people. The decree of the Master, God himself, who gathers in the exiles of Israel, I will gather others also. Gather them in with those already gathered. So the exact groups, people who were considered mutilated or foreigners, who had been explicitly banned, who couldn't be members, were the ones that got named, that were encouraged to be welcomed back into the community. Why? Because they had practiced Sabbath. You knew their faithfulness to God by how they practiced Sabbath, which is what we keep hearing again and again in this reading we're doing. This re-emphasizes the power and the importance of this particular kind of rest. Not just the fact that it is God commanded, but also to pay attention to who it is commanded, and that is everyone. We hear later, even the land is supposed to rest. So rather than being defined by where they were from or what they looked like, they were defined by how well they followed this commandment by God. Chapter this week makes me a little nervous. I was not so good with that commandment, the resting. But it's just one more reminder about how dangerous things happen when we don't take Sabbath seriously. We've heard about it in the last weeks, that without that kind of rest, it can make us anxious and fearful. that it can keep us in an unhealthy cycle of consumption and production. And without that rest, we honestly start to believe that we have created our own blessings by our own hard work with our good American Protestant work ethic, instead of crediting God. And here's the piece I think I'm at least trying to unpack or understand today, is that it also leads us to believe that Sabbath was only meant for certain people. And maybe we believe that more than just about Sabbath, but about all of God's blessings. That we start to believe that certain people deserve it more than others without that rest. And we know that's not, in fact, what the Scripture says about Sabbath at all. It says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or your female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. It says everyone rests. When I was thinking about this, I thought back to Thanksgiving, when I got to enjoy my Thanksgiving dinner and precious time with my extended family. I also knew at the same time there were people in this congregation and all around putting on their work clothes and headed to Walmart and to Target and to gas stations so that we could jump right back into consuming more things after consuming a big meal. They did not have Sabbath the way I had Sabbath. Those whose salaries do not match up with the basic bills for living when the minimum wage is not a living wage cannot experience Sabbath if they might starve or go homeless without work. Sabbath is also an economic resistance to a system that does not grant rest to everyone equally, just 1 day a week. And we think of Sabbath as rest and relaxation and slowing down, which it is. But there's also this other thing that happens when we stop and have time to think and reflect. And one of the things I think it calls us to reflect on are the ways that the world is in fact still broken by the systematic oppression of other people because of their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or their religious belief, or insert your own category. I can't talk about this without being overwhelmed by the news just of the last week to 2 weeks. Having heard the Department of Justice report on the systematic racism at the Ferguson Police Department, that then within days results in more violence. With the racist chant exposed at the University of Oklahoma, all in the midst of celebrating the short 50 years it has been since the violence at Selma because people wanted the right to vote in safety and equally. And I'd love to tell you that it's far away and it's other places. But I went to the Southern Poverty Law Center website and discovered there are equal number of hate groups in Indiana as there are in Kentucky. And we may not be those people using those awful phrases or committing those acts of hate or violence. When I read those, I also know I am still responsible to speak out against it, to make sure that I am also creating that doesn't allow any one group of people to be treated as if they are not created by the same God that I am. And one of the powerful things that Sabbath allows us to do is time to reflect on the fact that we were all created by the same beautiful, grace-filled, loving God. And the grace that makes our lives possible was meant for every living creature, not just the ones somebody claims are deserving. That we were made to be neighbors and neighborly. And that Sabbath gives us that opportunity. It gives us the space and the freedom to really see each other and listen to each other and share our stories and our lives. It's an occasion to remember that God's claim is always, always, always more inclusive than exclusive. Brueggemann says Sabbath deconstructs the notion of being qualified for membership, that what counts are the outcomes of your life. We heard this from John the Baptist in the Gospels. He speaks about this when the professional insiders bragged about how qualified they were to be God's chosen. We know John the Baptist had something to say about that. Do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. And even John the Baptist knows it's not about our church attendance, but what our lives produce. He says, even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. What matters is the good fruit. And how can we produce really good fruit if we never rest? When we don't rest, if we're always anxious or fearful, if we stay in that wheel of consumption that never ends, if we close our eyes and our ears to the cries of a broken system rather than inviting in our neighbor and listening. And God provides us with this wonderful gift of Sabbath. Invites us to take on this gift and produce fruits, the good fruits that can come from the stillness, that can come from the peacefulness, from the neighborliness of Sabbath.